On the morning of November 8, 2016, voters headed to churches, schools, and other local buildings to cast their ballots for the 45th President of the United States. For much of the race, Democratic Party candidate Hillary Clinton had maintained a 3 to 6 point average lead in the national polls over Republican Party candidate Donald Trump. Polling sites and analysts agreed. Betting markets, they put their money on Clinton, and newspapers prepared their headlines to acknowledge the election of the first female president of the United States. What happened next is widely considered one of the most shocking election results in world history. In today's lecture, we're going to take a deeper look at election polls. We'll first talk about the critical difference between scientific and unscientific polling. Next, we'll establish 5 important rules for good polling. This will help us distinguish between strong polls and weak ones and give us some indicators of when we can trust polls and when we should discount them. Finally, we'll apply our new knowledge to the 2016 US presidential election and see if we can gain some insight into why the polling didn't seem to match up to the election results. So let's get started. I want you to imagine for a moment that you love to go out for brunch. Now, for many of us, that won't take much imagination. I love brunch, and I'm always on the lookout for a good brunch spot. Pretend for a moment, though, that you're alone in a new town. Perhaps you just moved there, or maybe you're traveling there on business, and you want to find the best place for brunch, the place that all the locals go to and love. For the sake of our thought experiment, let's also assume that you have no easy access to the internet, so you can't consult any review sites. No, your only way of getting information is asking the people around you. So you wander around until you find an area with restaurants and you ask people on the street where you should go for brunch. The first person you ask says, "You must try Cafe Waffle. It has the best brunch in town." That is quite the recommendation, but we know that bias is a possibility, so you ask someone else a few moments later where the best brunch in town could be found. Definitely Cafe Waffle. Their strawberry waffle is to die for. You ask for directions and head toward Cafe Waffle. Along the way, you stop and ask another 24 people. Obviously, you're very serious about this. Every single person you ask recommends Cafe Waffle. Feeling great about your choice? You arrive and you order. The strawberry waffle is indeed delicious, but after that, your high expectations are let down. The meal is expensive, the service is slow, they get your order wrong, and the coffee is weak. Your experience is decidedly mediocre. Later that day, you finally get internet access and out of curiosity, consult the local best brunch in town listings. A local newspaper conducted a survey just last month asking a random sample of 1,000 city residents where the best brunch in town could be found, listing every restaurant that served brunch as an option. Cafe Waffle is listed as number 16 out of 20 brunch spots in town, receiving only 3% of the votes in the survey. How could this happen? Everyone you asked raved about Cafe Waffle, but your own experience and the article you read clearly disagreed. If we put your questions into polling terms, then 100% of respondents agreed that Cafe Waffle was the place to go for brunch. And yet only 3% of respondents to the Best Brunch in Town survey agreed. Now, there are plenty of potential explanations for this. Perhaps you didn't ask enough people. Maybe you have different preferences from the people you asked, or maybe you have coincidentally found the only 30 people in town who actually like Cafe Waffle. Whatever the reason, you ended up with a disappointing brunch. Now, both our method of asking and that of the Best Brunch in Town survey are types of polls. Our polling was unscientific. We chose our respondents based on convenience. We didn't try to stay consistent in how we asked the question, and the number of people we surveyed was tiny. An unscientific poll is one where respondents are chosen unsystematically, usually by some method other than random selection. In contrast, the Best Brunch in Town survey was a scientific poll. They drew a random sample of the city's residents. They could generalize from their sample to the wider city population and make stronger claims about resident attitudes towards brunch. A scientific poll is much more reliable, whether we want to understand the citywide consensus on public policy or simply where to go for waffles on a Sunday morning. Now, until the mid-20th century, most polling was unscientific. People would be asked for their opinions, and anyone who responded would be included in the results. There was little effort to monitor or control who was participating, and this led to quite a few mishaps in polling. One widely used type of unscientific poll is called the straw poll. If you've ever quickly polled a group of friends about whether Star Wars is better than Star Trek, or is that just me? Or asked your coworkers for a quick show of hands indicating their opinion on something, you've conducted a straw poll. A straw poll is an informal, unofficial measure of public opinion. There's no random selection, requirements of sample size, or any of the other hallmarks of a scientific poll. Why is it called a straw poll? Well, as the story goes, it's because we're measuring which way the wind of public opinion is blowing, as farmers used to determine the direction of the actual wind by throwing some stalks of straw in the air and watching what happened. Almost all of the early public opinion polls were straw polls. In some cases, they were quite accurate. In 1896, for example, the Chicago Record predicted how Chicago voters would vote in presidential election between Republican William McKinley and Democrat William Jennings Bryan, within 1/10 of a percentage point. But despite receiving 250,000 ballots back, the poll was only accurate in Chicago. In other areas surveyed, it was wrong. That was typically the case. Perhaps the most famous example of unscientific straw polling at work is that of the Literary Digest. Founded in 1890 as a weekly news magazine, the Literary Digest conducted the earliest widespread polling of a presidential election in the United States. For 4 straight elections in the 1920s and 30s, it correctly predicted the winner of the election. In 1936, it was poised to repeat this feat. It sent out 10 million surveys asking respondents to indicate their voting intentions. Amazingly, more than 2 million Americans returned their surveys, an astronomical number of responses. And they spoke loud and clear. Republican Alf Landon would win the 1936 presidential election over Democrat incumbent Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he would do it in a landslide. Except there never was a President Alf Landon. In fact, he only won 2 states in the Electoral College and received barely over 1/3 of the popular vote. So what went wrong in 1936? Why was the Literary Digest poll so much less accurate than that of the Record? Well, first, the Literary Digest poll was unscientific. They didn't randomly select their respondents, but instead sent out surveys to everyone they could reach. Second, the list of addresses they used, the sampling frames, were profoundly skewed. They sent surveys to their own subscribers as well as the addresses of car owners and those who owned a telephone. Guess what groups of people could afford magazine subscriptions, cars, and telephones in 1936 in the middle of the Great Depression? Rich people. The magazine ran headlong into sample bias. Their sample didn't represent the wider population, but only a particular subset. And rich people were much more likely to vote Republican in 1936. Third, the magazine suffered from non-response bias. There may have been something systematic about those other 8 million people who didn't respond to the survey, and the magazine didn't make an effort to track them down. Had the response rate been 100%, the prediction might have come out closer to reality. Poor Literary Digest. It couldn't overcome the embarrassment of this mistake, and the magazine went out of business in 1938. But from these ashes rose a new contender. Not every poll got it wrong in 1936. Another pollster, using new methods of selecting respondents, correctly predicted the outcome of the presidential race within 1 percentage point. And he did it with only 50,000 respondents, a fraction of the 2.2 million used by the Literary Digest. This pollster's name was George Gallup, and he is widely credited with the founding of scientific public opinion polling in America. From that date forward, scientific polling became the norm. Now, this doesn't mean that unscientific polling has completely disappeared. Actually, it's still quite common. For example, reality TV shows let viewers vote or not vote as they wish to determine the winners of programs such as American Idol and Dancing with the Stars. Or what about the time the National Pasta Association conducted a poll to find out what type of pasta best described people's personalities? Spaghetti beat out elbow macaroni 41% to 21%, in case you were interested. My favorite example of unscientific polling is when the Natural Environment Research Council in the United Kingdom asked members of the public to suggest and vote for names for their new polar research ship. I imagine that even if it had been done scientifically, the name Boaty McBoatface would still have won the popular vote. The ship was officially dubbed the RRS Sir David Attenborough, but they did use Boaty McBoatface to name one of the craft's underwater vessels. So certainly unscientific polls still have their moments to shine. Okay, we're assembling the puzzle pieces to understand what happened in the 2016 presidential election. So far, we've examined the basic differences between scientific and unscientific polls. Before we can evaluate the election, we have to dig deeper into what these scientific polls look like. They will also help us to recognize a good poll when we see it so that we can become more critical consumers of the news. So let's look at 5 rules of good polling. Rule number 1 is use a random sample. As we've already discussed a bit, a random sample is one where every member of a given population has the same chance of being included in our sample. We've already learned that the word population means the universe of cases we're interested in studying. In public opinion research, that means people. For the Literary Digest, it meant the entire voting population of the United States. For the Record, the Chicago City newspaper, it meant the residents of Chicago. Most public opinion research in the US is interested in adult American attitudes. That's usually, but certainly not always, our population. Now, a population is typically too big to study effectively. There are approximately 245 million adults in America. Imagine trying to track each and every one of them down. Think of the cost. No one would ever conduct a poll, ever. So instead, we use a sample or subset of the population. That's what we were doing when we informally asked people about their favorite brunch spot. And it's also what the Literary Digest did when it asked 10 million people about their voting preferences in 1936. Now, the most important thing that distinguishes a scientific poll from an unscientific poll is how that sample is chosen. Let's say we want to understand differences in how beagle owners train their pets. Our population in this case is beagle owners. If we say that there are 10,000 beagle owners in America, I'm making that number up, and we want to draw a random sample from those owners, then every single one of those 10,000 beagle owners would have an equal chance of inclusion in our sample. It doesn't matter if you live in Alaska or South Carolina, or if you've owned 10 beagles or just adopted your first. If your name is on the list of beagle owners, you are just as likely to be included as anyone else on that list. That's a random sample. Now, you might be asking yourself, why is this kind of sample so much better than the one used by the Literary Digest? The reason is that non-random samples are much more open to bias. As we saw with the Literary Digest, that sample was biased towards rich people, those who could afford magazine subscriptions, cars, and telephones in 1936. Sure, it's possible that with a random sample, you would end up with all rich people anyway. But when we use a random sample, we open ourselves to the world of probability theory, which means we can actually statistically estimate the likelihood that our sample represents our population. That means we can actually report back on how likely it is that our results correctly predict how the wider population thinks. In a non-random sample, such as the one used by the Literary Digest, we can't. Since ultimately we usually care about the population and not the sample, this is a big problem. So stick to random samples and you'll be in good shape. That brings us to rule number 2, use a large enough sample. If we have too few people, we introduce a higher risk of biasing our sample so that it doesn't reflect our population. We ran up against this problem in our poll of the best brunch in town. Remember how in rule number 1 we talked about how our ultimate goal is to understand our population? Random sampling is one way to ensure we do that, but the sample has to be large enough to allow for random chance to work its scientific magic. So what's the right size for your sample? Well, that all depends on your population, but most national public surveys with adult Americans as their population use at least 1,000 people. So 1,000 is a good number to look for if you have a large population. Okay, so let's say we have a random sample of the right size. Now what? Rule number 3 says that we must minimize sample bias. Sample bias occurs when our sample doesn't represent our population. We've already covered 2 causes of this bias, use of non-random sampling and use of a too small sample, but there are more mistakes we can make. Avoiding sample bias is really important. The trick to scientific polling is that we can have a reasonable level of confidence that our estimates are accurate. We have to minimize the chances of overconfidence. How do we do this? Well, one way is to ensure that we have a complete list of our population to draw from when we make our sample. If someone isn't on our list, they have no chance of being included in our sample. In national public opinion polling, this can be a problem. In the past, many polling firms conducted polls by calling landline telephones with phone numbers listed in the phone book. A few decades ago, that was a perfectly reasonable way to build a sample. But today, more than 50% of the population doesn't use a landline, only a mobile phone. And what's more, the mobile phone users share some unique traits, such as being in general younger than the landline users. So relying solely on landlines could lead to a biased sample. I'll give you one other cause of sample bias: non-response bias. Non-response bias occurs when some groups systematically refuse to respond to surveys. Have you ever been asked to take a survey? I have. It happens all the time. Folks on a street corner trying to get my attention as I walk by, typically in the winter when it's too cold for science. In recent years, it's online, pop-up windows when I head over to a website asking me for my opinion. Sometimes researchers contact me via email asking me to fill out a short survey for their latest project. Every time I say no, I'm a non-responder. For many surveys, 20 or 30% or more of the people they contact are non-responders. Sometimes it's as high as 80 or 90%. Now, this by itself is not necessarily a problem. The challenge is when there's something systematic about the non-responders that might affect the sample. Let's go back to our best brunch in town survey for a moment. Remember how it surveyed city residents to rank the top 20 brunch spots in town? What if none of the residents living near Cafe Waffle responded to the survey? That might account for why it did so poorly in the opinion poll. None of the folks who ate there often were included in the sample. So between rules 1, 2, and 3, I hope I've convinced you that the sample, how we select it, its size, and how we ensure inclusion is all really important to a good scientific poll. Unfortunately, there are plenty of other ways for our poll to fail. That brings us to rule number 4, minimize bias beyond the sample. Now, be warned, I could spend another half hour just discussing all the other ways in which our poll results can become biased, but I'll just briefly touch on a few big ones here. First, we have to pay attention to how the question and answer choices are worded and organized. As we discussed in a previous lecture, how you write your survey matters a lot in the results that you get. If you use a misleading question, a lot of jargon, or try to influence your respondents in a particular way, you'll introduce bias into your results. Second, sometimes people are unwilling to admit to beliefs that might be viewed as unpopular, shameful, or uninformed. They may claim to know more than they do, or in some cases, indicate that they hold an attitude they really don't. This is called social desirability bias. The respondent tells the interviewer what they think the interviewer wants to hear or what they think is the socially acceptable answer. The Bradley effect is an example of this. In 1982, polls showed that Tom Bradley had a lead in the California gubernatorial election, but he ultimately lost. Some analysts attributed the loss to Bradley's race, claiming that people were less likely to report in polls an unwillingness to vote for a black candidate. Finally, Be on the lookout for who commissioned and conducted the poll. If the group that paid for the poll or ran the poll is biased in a particular direction or hoping for a particular outcome, then those results should be scrutinized very closely, particularly if the results confirm their point of view. So that's rule number 4, minimize bias beyond the sample. Our last rule, rule number 5, lets us move beyond what we don't want bias and onto what we do. Rule number 5 calls for transparent methodology. In simple terms, good scientific polls report their methodology in a transparent way. Poor polls don't. What do I mean by transparency? Simply that whoever is reporting the poll information reveals the full methodology of how the poll was conducted and doesn't attempt to mislead readers by leaving information out. How polls are reported matters. If I find that 39% of Americans prefer pancakes and only 10% waffles, we can report that data in several ways. Let me read you a few possible headlines. Americans prefer pancakes to waffles by 4-1. The waffle is no longer among America's favorite foods. More than half of Americans reject pancakes and waffles. Die-hard waffle lovers keep to favorite food despite pressure from rise of pancakes. All of these are technically correct interpretations of our polling results, but you can imagine that first and second headlines would be vastly preferred by a pancake promotion group, while the waffle crowd would go for the last one. Analysts have found ways to deceive us as well. Sometimes they don't report options such as undecided or unsure, lest they muddy up the otherwise clear message of a graphic. I've also seen polls reported where the percentage adds up to more than 100, or where responses to 3 different questions are presented as if they were exactly the same. And analysts may overemphasize a single poll when really we should be looking at averages and trends. So how can a report on a poll be transparent? Well, at a minimum, a good poll will report the following key information: the questions and possible response options, the full breakdown of responses, including don't knows and unsures, a breakdown of how the surveys were conducted via telephone, in person, or online, a clear disclosure about who commissioned and conducted the survey. And a good poll will also have clear reporting on the sample size, the method of sampling, and the response rate, as well as how samples are weighted, the dates the survey was in the field, and the margin of error. Those last 3, weighted samples, the dates the survey was in the field, and the margin of error, are the only ones we haven't touched yet on our rules. So let's talk about those a bit. First, weighted samples. Most modern pollsters use weighting to adjust the sample's results to reflect particular demographics in the population. If a group represents 10% of the population, but only 1% of the sample belongs to that group, the pollster will typically weight the final results to increase the effect of the responses of those 1%. We want polls to let us know whether they used weighting, and if so, how they did it. We should see both the original raw results and the final weighted results. Second, the survey dates. The survey dates are important for a single reason: they matter. Imagine if you did a poll about terrorism prior to 9/11, but 2 months later, when you published your results, you left out the dates. That would leave out some incredibly important context for your study, and it wouldn't allow for valid comparisons with other research. Finally, how about margin of error? The margin of error is a measure of how precise and confident we are in our survey results. There's always a trade-off in polling between accuracy and precision. If we want to pinpoint the exact set of preferences in a population, say that 60% of Americans prefer waffles to pancakes, we're being very precise, but we run the risk of being inaccurate, of getting it wrong. If we want to ensure accuracy, we might instead give a range and say that somewhere between 57 and 63% of Americans prefer waffles to pancakes. In this case, we're more likely to be accurate, but our answer is less precise. The margin of error is a statistical calculation based on the estimated result from our sample, the sample size, and the level of confidence or accuracy we want to have. It gives us a range around our original estimate in which we can be highly confident. In most large national polls, this is about 3%. So when we say that 60% of Americans prefer waffles to pancakes, a 3% margin of error means that our actual estimate is between 57 and 63%. Typically, we want to use a 95% confidence interval. This means we acknowledge that 5 times out of 100, our estimate is just flat wrong. We could improve that level of accuracy, say to only 1 time out of 100, but if we do, the margin of error will go up and reduce our precision. So that's rule number 5, ensure a transparent methodology. We're now ready to answer our final question. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by about 2% compared to the 3 or 4% that the final national polls had her at prior to the election. And yet, Donald Trump won the right combination of states to win the Electoral College, 304 to 227. Why was there a mismatch between the polls and the votes in the 2016 US presidential election? Let's apply our 5 rules to find out. Rule 1 is to use a random sample. Almost all of the national polls reported in the news media used a random sample. The only ones that didn't were the snap polls taken online, following the debates, and at various points throughout the campaign. These polls let people self-select into the sample. If you were on the website, you could vote and keep voting as many times as you wanted. But the mainstream polls, like the ABC News Washington Post poll, the Fox News poll, and the New York Times CBS poll, these all had a random sample. So rule 1, check. How about rule 2, using a large enough sample? Let's keep our focus on those 3 big polls I just mentioned. In the final poll prior to the election, the ABC News poll had a sample of 2,200 likely voters. CBS had 1,753 in their sample, including 1,426 registered voters. The Fox News poll had 1,410 respondents, with 1,295 of them likely voters. Remember, that key number to look for here is about 1,000 respondents, and all 3 major polls exceeded that threshold. So rule 2, check. That brings us to rule number 3, minimize sample bias. It's here where we find that first crack in the polling data. First, there's some evidence of non-response bias. In some cases, the response rate to polls was only 10%. And as we said in rule 3, if there's something systematic about the non-responders, the poll could be in trouble. And there probably was something systematic. Some strong Trump supporters were difficult to reach. Think about the older, rurally based voter who might not use the internet for taking polls. They were left out. Non-college educated white males, one of the strongest groups supporting Trump, were systematically underpolled during the election. They were left out too. Another problem is that emphasis on the likely voter. Pollsters have to figure out who is likely to vote, and only those folks are included in a sample. But it looks like that their estimate of who is and is not a likely voter may have been off in 2016. So we're starting to see some issues here with sample bias. What about rule number 4, which calls for minimizing bias beyond the sample? Here too, the polls found some trouble. There's some evidence of a shy Trump voter, someone who participated in the polls but may have been hesitant to voice their support for the Republican candidate. Trump was constantly bombarded during the campaign with serious moral accusations, so it's easy to see why some voters might have held their opinions close to the vest. There was also a lot of mistrust of the media during the election, and this may have led people to say no thanks when contacted to participate in a poll. Finally, Rule 5 calls for transparent methodology. While the pollsters themselves were pretty transparent about their methods, the media organizations reporting them sometimes were not. Remember, this rule requires that those reporting the polls do so responsibly. Many large media organizations actively supported Clinton to win. While Trump received almost no major newspaper endorsements, Clinton received support from dozens. Even the typically neutral USA Today took a side for the first time in its history, calling Trump unfit for the presidency. Whether intentionally or not, some headlines by these media organizations were pro-Clinton, even when the polling data was ambiguous. For example, take the ABC News tracking poll conducted in the final days of the election. It had Clinton up 47 to 43%. That's a 4-point difference, but with a margin of error of plus or minus 2.5 points, creating a 5-point spread, Clinton's lead would not be considered statistically significant. The article announcing the poll in the Washington Post acknowledges this, but goes on to note that a 4-point lead would be a quote-unquote comfortable margin on Election Day, and notes that it was the same size as Barack Obama's lead prior to his victory over Mitt Romney in 2012. The headline hardly read, "Final poll within the margin of error, election too close to call." We also saw some evidence of herding, the tendency for pollsters to follow the herd and release numbers similar to other polls. Pollsters fear being wrong, so if their results contrast with other respected polls, they may re-weight their samples to produce more uniform results and don't disclose those changes. Finally, there's the problem of using national polls in the first place. Presidential elections are conducted on a statewide basis. Winning the most votes in a state wins you all of that state's electoral college votes. As we saw, Clinton won the popular vote, and her share of the vote was actually within the margin of error of those final polls. But she still lost the election. National polls are simply not a good enough proxy for the statewide polling that's needed to predict electoral college results. So there you have it. The polls in the 2016 presidential election, although scientific, failed to follow all 5 rules of good polling. While they used random selection in large enough samples, they failed to minimize error in the sample thanks to low response rates, exclusion of key groups of people, and likely voter models that may have underestimated enthusiasm for Trump. They also suffered from some other forms of bias, such as the social desirability bias of the shy Trump voter. And finally, while the pollsters themselves were mostly transparent about their methods, media organizations didn't always remain neutral or give context to their reporting, leaving us with the mistaken assumption that Clinton was sure to win.